Oh, and welcome to today's webinar, which looks at what yesterday's historic spending review means for the housing sector. I think it would be fair to say that the headline figure of 39 billion for the Affordable Homes Programme exceeded expectations and indeed exceeded a lot of the headline speculation in advance of the spending review. But if that's a big news, a big headline, the idea of today's event is to explore the likely impact of the measures in the budget in the spending review across the sector, talk about where it leaves the sector and what the next steps from various providers and key players are likely to be as a result. So before I move to our panel today, I'll take a very quick run through some of the central announcements yesterday to help set the scene for our discussion. As I mentioned, that 39 billion for a new 10-year affordable homes programme dominated discussions yesterday, more than expected, and the long-term focus that the sector have been asking for as well. On top of that, there was the news of a 10-year CPI plus 1% rent settlement, and the news that the government will be consulting on rent convergence, which again had been a central part of the sector's lobbying effort in advance. Another key ask was also addressed with the news that the social housing sector would get equal access to government funding to remediate tower blocks. Then there was an announcement of a new multi-year crisis and resilience fund, the 13.2 billion warm homes plan, and nearly 1 billion for councils to increase the supply of temporary accommodation via the fourth round of the local authority housing fund. The Green Book review as well, the findings and actions, and efforts to unlock investments in the sector too. So that is just a very quick run through of a headline selection of announcements and significant moves that emerged yesterday. We'll be hearing from our panel in a few moments about what that's likely to mean for them and the communities they work in very shortly, along with any other significant details we should be looking out for. And we might address some of the remaining question marks, such as the delivery of homes for social rent or the future for regeneration as we go. So to guide us through things today, we'll be hearing from Nick Hatkin, the Chief Executive of Yorkshire Housing and the Chair of the York and North Yorkshire Housing Partnership, Joanne Drew, Strategic Director of Housing Regeneration at Enfield Council and Co-Chair of the London Housing Directors Group, Melanie Leach, Chief Executive of the British Property Federation, Sophie Bubis, Head of Policy and Research at HomelessLink, which Inside Housing has been partnering on as part of the Reset Homelessness campaign in the run-up to the spending review. So we'll be talking a bit about that later as well. And Rose Grayston, consultant, former policy manager at Shelter, and current expert advisor to Matthew Pennycook, who is speaking in a personal capacity, I should stress today. Before we start, a reminder for everybody who's tuning in today as well, and I know there's a lot of you, this is absolutely for you, and hopefully to get answers to some of the questions you've got and help you work through some of the takeaways from the spending review. So please do use the question box as we go, and I'll get through as many of your questions once we've heard from our panelists with their opening thoughts and statements, reflecting on the spending review in a moment. But yeah, please do use that question box as we go, and I'll get round as many as possible. Right, that is a very, very quick run through because we want to get into the meat of the discussion as quickly as possible. So welcome all, great to see you all here today. And Nick, I'll hand over to you first, if that's okay, for your opening thoughts and reflections on yesterday.
Thanks, Martin. I'm sure everybody on this call probably was like me yesterday when you watched or listened to the spending review. You couldn't help but have a huge smile on your face. I think for me, what's clear is that the government has listened, but importantly, acted on the representations that have been made by the housing sector ahead of the spending review. And let's be really clear about what was announced yesterday. This is by far and away the biggest investment in affordable housing we've seen in decades. And, you know, that commitment to a decade-long £39 billion affordable homes programme that sits alongside a 10-year rent settlement underpinned by rent convergence. For me, I think this genuinely provides a once-in-a-generation opportunity to really start to make a headway into tackling the housing crisis. There was also, I think, alongside the big headline number of new homes, there was also the really welcome news that the £1 billion Building Safety Fund has now been opened up to housing associations as well. And I know for many that has been a source of frustration for quite some time. So for me, all of this sends a really strong signal that the government recognises the vital role that housing plays in driving economic growth for the UK economy. And we also need to be realistic about this. This is at a time when the government's finances are under considerable pressure. We've seen, the economic growth figures today were lower than were expected. So the decision to prioritise housing over many other sectors and give us pretty much everything we've asked for is a really positive endorsement of the role that we all now have and need to play in the delivery of what is the largest investment in social housing, certainly in my 30 plus years of working in this world. So I think we should feel energized by the scale of this opportunity. Building at levels not seen in 70 years isn't just a challenge. For me, it's a bit of a rallying call. And I think we've got, really good levels of collaboration at the moment in the housing sector. So using those partnerships and also the creativity that we've got across our sector, I think we can really help shape the future for housing for the next generation. So we need to be bold. This is a moment. So we need to be bold and we need to be forward thinking. And we also, for me, I think importantly, we need to maintain our collective voice and welcome what the government has done and demonstrate our real commitment to delivering against what's on offer here. And I am realistic. I appreciate there are still some questions over issues such as the number of homes that the government are looking to deliver, that will be in the prospectus that will follow later this year, grant rates, capacity of the construction sector, and whether there are the skills to deliver at the scale that is required. But what importantly, these are all now things that are within our gift to progress. So in closing, I think we'll look back at this point in time and think, wow, that really was the start of a new golden era for housing in England. And if that doesn't get you excited and energized, then call an ambulance as your heart has clearly stopped beating. Back to you, Martin.
Thanks, Nick. Yeah, absolutely. There's so much to get our teeth into, a challenge in terms of that kind of collective voice as well, because it's really interesting that the lobby has clearly certainly in a number of areas worked, but now we move to kind of that implementation and the sector's offer, and it'll be great to talk about what that will be moving forwards as well. But also, some significant challenges out there too to address. And Joanne, I think we might pick up on some of those in a minute's time. So, Joanne, welcome, and over to you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I absolutely share Nick's excitement and enthusiasm for the announcements yesterday, which are obviously game-changing. In London, our housing pressures are huge, as they are across the country. We've been already gearing up with production of a system-wide housing mission to be led by the Housing Partnership Board, which brings together councils, London councils, the GLA, housing associations and developers and the voluntary sector to look at how we can accelerate delivery. So this 10-year settlement is absolutely critical to supporting that joined up mission that we're taking in London. Of course, we're always looking at the detail. London has had around 35% of the affordable housing programme in previous settlements. The bridge funding or the top-up funding was allocated to London in 20%. So we have strong appetite for development in London, and we're keen to make sure that we get a good allocation from the AHP. I think in terms of our council-led development, our housing revenue accounts are clearly under pressure. We're all facing pressures on costs and demand, and particularly so in London because of our stock profile. So rent convergence is critical to us, and we're looking forward to seeing the consultation document come through as soon as possible, so that we can help to shape that. In London, we think that we need to go back to basics and look at the foundations of the rent formula, because at the moment they're about 13% away from where we need it to be. So recognising that that national rent convergent formula does need to be looked at to reflect the priorities in London. I think, you know, the long-term settlement on development is also really key to support our regeneration programmes, where we are tackling poor quality housing as well as increasing supply. So I think that's really important. We've obviously got to recognise that there are conversations to be had with our residents about the impact of rent changes and on obviously rent fairness across the board. And I think the Warmer Homes funding and the restatement of access to that 13 million pot is really key here, because that's going to help with our residents' fuel bills. And also, I think our plea around that would be to get it out quickly to councils, to housing associations, and in a grant form rather than a co-funded form, because we can do so much more so quickly, and that can help the cost pressures that residents are experiencing as well. I think on from a local government perspective, obviously our finances are on the floor at the moment from a variety of different demand-led pressures, whether that's SEND, children's services, adults, but particularly in London, temporary accommodation challenges. So we're waiting the consultation paper on local government reform, and we also are very keen to see how that will allocate funding according to deprivation and need, and how we will be able to address the crisis that we're experiencing in funding for homelessness services. But we particularly welcome the continued and larger investment in the LAF Housing Fund, which is has been a very successful fund for us in London, and also the 100 million to invest in upstream prevention. But I think it's really important to recognise that whilst we're looking at prevention-based initiatives, the funding to deal with the crisis that we're facing in homelessness is also really key. So some more details for local government to come out that will enable us to have a rounded view, but certainly we're very excited about the prospects to be able to really turbocharge our development programmes. And obviously, just finally, as a council, we have an strategic enabling role with working with all players in the housing system locally. So we're really keen to play that partnership system level role locally, to see how we can join up and accelerate supply. And it's great to hear the enthusiasm of housing associations and developers to be part of that journey with us. Thank you, Martin.
Fabulous. Thanks, Joanne. Loads to get stuck into there, and yeah, so lots of questions already coming in actually. So thanks very much for that. We'll get through as many of your questions as possible over the course of the event. So yeah, thank you very much. Do keep them coming in, and we'll pick up on as many as possible. Thank you, Joanne, very much, and Melanie, welcome, and the floor is yours. Over to you.
Thank you, Martin. And gosh, it's what I won't do is repeat all of the positive things that have already been said, with which I wholeheartedly agree. For those who don't know, the British Property Federation, I represent the private sector part of this conversation. So primarily investors in long-term rental, whether it's pension funds, savings funds, and so on, and increasingly investing in the affordable and social housing sector through various different models, either for-profit registered providers or in various partnerships with housing associations and other providers. So we'd absolutely, representing that constituency, echo the support and the positive nature. And I think it's really important, as I said right up front, is to recognise this is against the background of incredibly tough decisions that the government had to take. So really walking the walk on that commitment to delivering homes, and in particular affordable and social homes, I think is really, really significant and should be absolutely welcomed. I guess, from my perspective, we do believe that whatever the government's trying to deliver, it will have to be in partnership, in public-private partnership. And so, what's important for private investors in all of this, it's certainly the health of the sector, the health of the social housing sector. So delighted to see the direct investment into that. We think that the investment by government unlocks private sector funding, so unlocks additional funding. So there's a multiplier effect to the money that the government's putting in, which will help to deliver even more homes, as well as the better health of the sector, I think. And investors most want certainty. So almost the most significant part of the announcement yesterday for us was that 10-year rent settlement, because that does give you certainty on which to plan. And I'm sure there's big questions around, how much you can actually rely on that certainty. But actually tackling the affordable housing crisis and the housing crisis more widely is a cross-party issue. So I would, have hope and a reasonable degree of expectation that this is a commitment that will stick. And it's certainly, I think, one that investors will welcome and will be key to unlocking additional funding from the private sector into affordable and social housing. I guess just a couple of other things to mention, which we may or may not need to come back to. I think it's right to look at the wider regeneration agenda too. And actually, one of the very significant announcements there yesterday, potentially, particularly outside London and the South East, was the review of the Green Book, which is sending a signal that government recognises it needs to change the way it thinks about the value it puts on projects, how it takes decisions about government funding, to take account of wider policy objectives and to take account of the very different circumstances that apply across the country, as well as the delivery of social as well as economic objectives. So I think that could be really significant as well over time. I think the investments in the Local Growth Fund, the Growth Mission Fund, partly pulling together stuff that's already going on, but also making a renewed commitment to that regeneration, to that town centre agenda, I think is significant. And also finally, because we represent the UK PropTech Association, which is a part of the British Property Federation, the announcement just before the actual spending review statement itself around the new AI tool for planning, if we can drive costs out of the planning system, whether that's through the use of technology or in other ways, if we can do that, that frees up millions of pounds for additional investment directly into the delivery of homes and the workplaces and communities that we all want to see across the country. Thanks, Martin.
Thanks, Melanie. So much to talk about there. Loads and loads of questions coming in. We will try and get through as many of them as possible. Thanks so much. A real variation coming through as well, and some of the issues that Melanie, you were flagging there, and definitely coming through. Uncertainty is one of them. The Green Book review, definitely want to come back to that as well. So thanks very much, Melanie and Sophie. Welcome, and over to you for your opening thoughts.
Thank you, Martin. And I'm going to take a slightly different angle. I'm here representing homelessness rather than what I would call housing proper. I always feel like a slight interloper in these spaces, but obviously a huge amount of crossover and reflection there. Homeless Link, for those who don't know, we represent over 750 frontline homelessness organisations across England, and most of our members are supporting people who aren't eligible for statutory housing duty. They're not necessarily accessing temporary accommodation. They've not got access to social housing readily, and we're spanning a huge range of services working across homelessness prevention, relief, holistic support, the supported accommodation sector, support housing sector is a huge part of the people that we are working with. Often the last line of defence for some of obviously the country's most vulnerable residents. We have been sort of approaching, coming into the spending review, our big ask in the run-up to the spending review, and this was part of our Reset Homelessness campaign that we were running in partnership with Inside Housing, was actually around the need for a wholesale reset of the funding model. We have a homelessness system at the moment that's currently sort of enormously costly and enormously inefficient. Homelessness of all forms is rising. It's putting pressure on local authorities, on the homelessness sector, on the housing sector, and we're very much stuck in firefight crisis mode at the moment, which is at the detriment of everyone, for those experiencing homelessness, for the services trying to support, for local government finances, and obviously national government finances as well. Housing, of course, underpins a huge amount of this, and I share the enthusiasm of my fellow panelists around the announcements on the scale and length of the capital commitment to affordable housing. But for us, ending homelessness and rough sleeping hinges not just on the sufficient supply of affordable housing. Of course, it's a massive part of it, but it's also alongside the capacity of services to deliver high quality, sustainable support. So we've been very encouraged at budget by the inclusion of homelessness in the proposed phase 2. So in this spending review round, which was looking at reforming homelessness funding, that Treasury would work with MHCLG and others to look at addressing homelessness and rough sleeping in a more kind of cross-governmental way through the interministerial task force. That has been our big ask. We've been working with Inside Housing, as I said, on really pushing that. So did we get it? Not really, but in a very sort of classic after one of these big moments, but also not no. There's a lot we do know now. There's a lot we still don't know. And there's also some really interesting indicative things that have told us about the direction of travel that we're looking at as we go ahead. I think firstly for us, a big part was the protection of existing homelessness and rough sleeping budgets. That was a huge relief given the cuts to revenue spending elsewhere. We haven't had the full breakdowns yet of what that will look like, but we're taking that to mean, and the early indications we're getting is that that will mean a continuation of £1 billion a year commitment over the next 3 years. This is obviously very good. We don't have any detail of how that spend will be allocated. We'd anticipated this because alongside the spending review, we're also getting a new homelessness strategy expected in the autumn. And that is where we were expecting to see the detail. The CSR there hasn't really given us the transformative change that we were hoping for, but they have set the envelope and the baton has now really been passed to MHCLG to pick up. And they can still choose to change the approach, the structures of homelessness funding to really get to the root causes, the systemic challenges that the sector is facing. We've also seen a really positive shift to prevention rhetoric. That's extremely welcome. There's a narrative throughout the spending review on a focus on prevention within public services, relying less on crisis management. That is, you know, the homelessness sector is the poster child of crisis over prevention, and so very, very welcome. And homelessness is also one of 4 prevention priorities for the £3.2 billion transformation fund, which is funding part of this £100 million pot for early intervention to prevent homelessness and rough sleeping. It's welcome. It's a drop in the ocean in terms of what we need to see in funding and prevention, but it does suggest that understanding of that need to shift and try and test innovation and intervention within that prevention space. Also very welcome is this extra 950 million into temporary accommodation, support for remediation costs and improving the quality of TA. At the moment, temporary accommodation, a massive drain on local authority finances, and it's also absorbing a lot of the funding available for wider homelessness relief services. If this funding can take some of that pressure off and then enable better quality or better investment in wider rough sleeping and homelessness prevention and relief service, that's of course very welcome. Slightly disappointed that the focus there is investing in improving TA rather than looking at the structural causes of why TA is rising and why we're not kind of relieving that. But a little bit like we're accepting the problem, but anything that can help kind of relieve that pressure for local authorities is also welcome. It's a 3-year settlement, again, very, very welcome. After a long period of what we get of kind of annual rollovers of homelessness funding, 3 years is welcome. We need that to translate down to the local authority government settlements, and then, of course, for local authorities to translate that down to their commission contracts. There's a few other sort of interesting things of note within this space. There's a £100 million fund for transformation on adults with complex needs. The promised new social impact investment vehicle is quite intriguing, is potentially something that we could look to in this space. And also the Crisis and Resilience Fund. That's really welcome. It's the first sort of ever multi-year settlement of this kind. It's bringing in discretionary housing payments into that fund. It's looking more holistically at the drivers of hardship and poverty and housing risk within households. And it speaks to that approach that we would have wanted to see across the wider homelessness fund and sector, that long-term, more holistic, and allowing local areas to drive what the change they want and need is. If used well, these funds, those 3 kind of new vehicles, could actually be what we want to see in terms of shifting the accountability and responsibility for homelessness prevention more upstream and into different spaces beyond the sort of statutory homelessness and homelessness relief system. So there's real indication of green shoots here, and prevention being a big focus. Of course, the housing news and the kind of consolidation of some of those different funds. But what we haven't really seen is that suggestion of the big transformation or the big changes we need to see to reform the homelessness system, turn the tap off of new flow, and really tackle some of the systemic challenges we're seeing that are trapping people in rough sleeping and homelessness crisis. And it doesn't quite step up to the promise of big reform and commitments to cross-government led work that we'd seen at the budget. And we're not going to prevent and end homelessness without recognising that cross-departmental kind of accountability we need to see from across, health, justice, Home Office, DWP, education, etc. So we're not perhaps as overwhelmingly positive as colleagues in the housing sector, but it's certainly not been a disaster for us. It feels like we still are waiting to see what the big change ahead is for us. We have sort of CSR as stage one, and now sort of the baton has been passed to MHCLG for stage two with the strategy, backed by the interministerial group that's chaired by Deputy Prime Minister. We really want to see that as our chance to use the envelope that Treasury set out and given MHCLG to look at driving forward that kind of headline promise of transformational change and prevention focus. So I think for those in the homelessness sector, there's a lot to take in, a lot still that we don't know, and we can't take our foot off the gas. I think there's a lot of work for us to do over the summer and in the influencing ahead for the strategy. And I will hand back over to you, Martin.
Thanks, Sophie. Yeah, loads to pick up on there, and I think a balance between where we are and some of the challenges and decisions still to be made to work through. And I think actually definitely not an interloper, because actually that kind of working together and working through things really important in terms of that cross-departmental working. We'll come back to that shortly. Loads and loads of questions coming in, but do keep them coming in, and we will get to them very, very shortly. Thanks so much, Sophie. Rose, welcome, and over to you for some thoughts on what we've heard so far.
Thanks, Martin. So as I was chatting with other panelists just before this event, I was reflecting on the fact that I joined housing almost exactly 10 years ago, 1 week after the disastrous July 2015 emergency budget, which saw a surprise 1% a year rent cut alongside a suite of other measures that shook the foundations of social housing. A lot of those measures were so stupid and poorly thought through that they were never actually implemented. But those were certainly dark days for social housing. Today, we finally have a chance to rebuild social housing into what it should be. Social housing is the foundation of addressing and preventing homelessness. But I don't want social housing to be a minority tenure for the most vulnerable, tightly rationed and allocated to manage down extreme costs and temporary accommodation. I can hear that you don't either. I want social homes at the heart of our communities and local economies, providing great homes and neighbourhoods people want to live in, competing on quality and security as well as affordability. So the challenge then is this. The government has given social housing a vote of confidence. The money is not enough to do everything that people need and deserve, but it's a bloody good start. After decades of decline, we have a new chance to make the case for social housing as a virtue of our communities, not a necessary evil in a failing system. How are we all going to work together to make the most of it? How are we going to reset our collective mentality from one of managed decline to determined renewal? Because millions of people out there are counting on us. My number one reflection on what's needed from all of us now, and sounds like it's shared by everybody speaking today, collaboration. Because firstly, we don't have the time, resources, or energy to fight the same battles across 100 different organisations. And secondly, the voice of housing is so much louder, more impactful, and more relevant to solving the real problems the country faces when we speak together. Now, I know collaboration can be a nightmare. How do you get different people in different types of organisations representing different interest groups in different parts of the country to coalesce around common messages, strategies, and policy asks? All I can tell you is that when you do it, it makes a difference. And if you do more of it, it will be worth it. A final thought on how to win more change for the communities that you represent. There is no the government. There is no unified view of what should happen within individual departments, let alone across the whole of government. The way you win change is to identify your most powerful allies inside and outside government and to tool them up with the evidence and arguments they need to win fights. Much of that evidence and those arguments really can only come from you, because government knows it doesn't deliver things. It sets the parameters for delivery and it funds it, but it is you who deliver the goods, and you who see the real world consequences when delivery isn't working first. Politicians see the end results of policy failure for individuals in their surgeries. Civil servants see that failure about a year later in official statistics. You are on the front line. You can spot risks and opportunities at the level of a place, across a stock of homes, across communities of workers and service users, in time to do something about it. So tell government what's not working, what's standing in the way of delivering, and more importantly, what's needed to fix it. Be specific, be technical. Tell the government what it doesn't, what it can't know. Everyone now has a common interest in making this new investment deliver. Everyone wants it to work. Let's assume the best of each other's intentions, but never ever assume that someone else has got it all figured out. Your knowledge, experience, and insights are absolutely essential. Government cannot do it without you, in my personal opinion.
Fabulous. Thanks, Rose. Yeah, lots to pick up on there. Sorry, I was getting a message there saying my microphone was playing up, so hopefully you can hear me. Yeah, lots to pick up on there, and a real rallying cry there. Be specific, be technical, tell government what it can't know, and identify your most powerful allies as well. And I should say, by the way, I think the lobbying effort from the sector, National Housing Federation in particular, deserves a nod. But yeah, there's been a lot of very, I think, as Nick was saying earlier, kind of speaking with one voice across the sector. Lots to kind of learn from there as we move forwards as well. Loads of questions coming in. We've got about half an hour, just under a half an hour left to try and get through as many of them as possible. So I welcome everybody back at this stage, and we'll try and get through as many of your priorities and your questions that have arisen during the course of the discussions. There's more flying through as we go. Yeah, lots to pick up on. There's kind of a few themes emerging. One, I think certainty, certainly there. So what certainty have you got when it comes to planning? Some specific issues, which perhaps ties in with what Rose was just saying there. So some specific issues that still need to be worked through, and we want to kind of talk about what that looks and feels like, and then some specific questions about things like those rent increases. What does that conversation look like? The issues that Joanne was raising earlier. So lots to pick up on. Where shall we start? I think, yeah, Nick, perhaps we'll come to you with that kind of point around certainty. So very enthusiastic about where we are, but a couple of questions that have kind of come through around quite how much certainty you've actually got when you're planning. So you've got the certainty in terms of the funding, perhaps, but things like the rent settlements, they've changed quite a lot over a period of time. How does that kind of feed into your thinking around that? So there's a couple of questions come in. Will the rent settlement be backed by legislation? We have had rent settlements previously, which got changed very quickly. Yeah, I guess given that, is this really as transformational as some suggest? Very significant financial commitment, but can we really trust a 10-year plan given the volatile nature of economic forecasts and politics? So there's some external factors playing in. How does that influence your thinking when it comes to what this really means?
Yeah, and it's a fair comment. You know, we're in a world where the last 10 years rent settlement wasn't actually followed for 7 of the 10 years. So it's not surprising that there's a degree of skepticism. But I think the point Rose made when she set the scene really, which was when she joined the housing world in 2015. You know, social housing was seen as a necessary evil in a failing housing system, I think was the phrase I'm going to paraphrase that you used, Rose. And that's not the case anymore. You know, right at the beginning, even before this government was elected, they talked about rebuilding the capacity of housing association business plans in their manifesto. That was the first time I've ever seen that in any political party's manifesto. And I think what we've seen with the general election pledge around the 1.5 million homes is that housing, for the first time, has been placed front and centre in government policy. Previously, it's probably been 5th, 6th, 7th in the list of priorities, but housing is right up there. And I think the fact that also that it's underpinned by, it falls within the remit of the Deputy Prime Minister, that gives you a sense of where this sits. In terms of how it could be underpinned, I mean, certainly in the run-up to the announcement yesterday, my organisation, along with some of the housing partnerships across the country, we're asking for the reclassification of investment in housing as infrastructure spend. Two reasons for that, really. One was to provide the long-term certainty and all the reasons for that, which are well rehearsed already, but also secondly to give us the certainty. And I think what the announcement yesterday has done has given us about as much certainty as you can ever hope for. And yes, you could say, well, let's have it underpinned by legislation. But if we're being really honest, any government can overturn any piece of legislation at any point. So actually what we have here is probably about the best we could hope for. And that, I suppose, is why it gives me a renewed sense of enthusiasm around this actually translating into reality in terms of the government policy. We'll see that in the long-term plan for housing, which is due to come forward shortly, alongside things like the infrastructure strategy. But you know, I think we've got a government that absolutely sees the value of housing, places that front and centre in terms of rebuilding the UK economy, but also recognising the fact that we are living through a housing crisis, and has got a really clear focus on actually trying to tackle that. So it's not in its interests to undermine any of the key foundations that will support the delivery of that.
Thanks, Nick. And yeah, a really thorough answer to those questions that were coming through. I'm going to try and group them together if they're kind of thematically linked. Joanne, I'll bring you in next, actually, just because while we're talking about that kind of long-term certainty, I guess that's the kind of business certainty and the kind of and when we're talking about the desperate need for social housing that was outlined. I mean, the very widely agreed figures, 90,000 homes in England a year needed, and there's some questions about how close we're getting to that with this money, which I'll come to in a minute. But actually, also about what that certainty means for tenants and residents. Above inflation rent increases. Whether there's going to be an affordability issue for people here. Joanne, you were talking earlier about the need to have that conversation with tenants and residents. I'll bring you in on that question. What does that conversation look and feel like, and how should the sector approach that?
Yeah, I think so. I think that having been out on the Enfield big door knock this week and talking to a lot of tenants, I think they're very aware of the pressures that local government and housing services are facing, and they can see us working hard to keep their council housing services at the standard we want to deliver, but they can see the rising prices that they and we are experiencing. It's very clear that good quality services is important to them. So I'm clear that they support that aim. I think the other thing I would want to sort of highlight is the regeneration agenda, which tackles improved quality and new supply. With certainty over the longer period, we can more confidently spend the upfront money that's needed to bring forward some of these large and complex regeneration schemes, which ultimately provides benefits for our tenants by virtue of them knowing that there will be homes for their families and future generations to stay in communities with them. So I think when we're having the conversation with tenants, it's about showing the bigger picture around what we can do with more sensible rent levels. And I think our residents in London look at the costs of private rented accommodation, and whilst everyone is struggling with the cost of living crisis, you know, social rent levels comparatively offer a good solution. So I think there are things that we need to talk to tenants about and priorities that we need to explore with them. But overall, the ability to bring forward more homes for families to stay together and keep those services where they need to be, and places where people can kind of build their families and thrive is really important to tenants, having spoken to them.
Thanks very much, Joanne. And actually, Joanne, I'll keep you there, and just while we're in this discussion, I'll just keep it there for a second. There's a few questions around what do we know about the mix of tenures. So between social, affordable, shared ownership is one question. There's a few questions along those lines about that mix, and I guess to pick up on kind of Rose's point earlier as well. That just in terms of that kind of lobbying moving forwards and being specific. And Nick, I might come back to you as well. What's kind of needed in terms of social rent as well within that? So a few questions about what the mix is, and how important it is to have a mix perhaps and have that defined. So I guess that might be the conversation moving forwards, but how does that progress in your opinion? So Joanne, I'll move to you first, and then Nick, and then we'll. Yeah.
Obviously, mixed tenure is really important, and at the moment we can't build enough homes across all tenures to meet needs. I think social rent tenure is certainly the priority for many boroughs and is a priority for the GLA, and working with housing associations in particular that do this really well. Shared ownership products can be a really good part of the solution. Again, going back to regeneration schemes, we're finding that shared equity solutions to rehome leaseholders who are marginal home buyers often is another product which is actually very helpful in terms of helping to support people move to different regenerated schemes. So I think I'm also conscious in London we the GLA have been consulting on a key worker rent tenure, which is really interesting, and I know that many of the boroughs are really keen on seeing whether we can get a product for key workers moving forward. So I think there's innovation to explore as well in tenure, as well as using the traditional models that we have.
Thanks very much. And Nick, I'll just bring you in very quickly on that, but just in terms of that kind of the specifics we were talking about, what do you need, and how are you going to be feeding that into the system now?
Without a shadow of a doubt, we all know that there's an acute need for social rent, particularly as market rents have continued to increase significantly. That does make affordable rents, if they're at 80% of the market rent, much more challenging for some households. I think I was heartened by the letter that was sent to all housing association chief execs yesterday by Matt Pennycook, because he made specific reference to this, and he basically said that the programme will prioritise homes for social rent, whilst also providing funding for a mix of tenures which included affordable rent and shared ownership in those examples. I think the key for me is, my understanding is that Homes England are now working up their prospectus. In other words, the details behind what types of homes will be built and at what grant levels. I think the key now is, again, for us as a sector to have a collective voice in terms of helping to shape what goes into that prospectus. And I think also, just secondly, on one of the points I've seen in the chat around affordability and particularly around convergence, again, in the letter from Matt Pennycook, it was very clear that the convergence proposals convergence will be implemented, but the consultation is around how and at what levels, and whether that will be an additional £1 per week or an additional £2 per week. So it won't be some of the much larger convergence increases that we may have seen in the past.
Thanks very much, Nick. Really detailed answer, and Joanne and Rose. I don't know if you want to come in and reflect on that at this stage, and Melanie, then I'll come to you because I've got a few quite specific questions for you as well. So yeah, Rose.
So on the AHP, the balance between 10 years, I think the challenge now is genuinely going to be spending the money, because we've had decades in which development capacity has been eroded. We need to rebuild. The long-term settlements that we've got are going to be really crucial to doing that. But now you will need to do the work to demonstrate that the pipeline is there, right? And that will determine on what terms the money is available and the design of a future affordable homes programme. There is definitely a recognition that 10 years other than social rent make a valuable contribution on a number of different fronts, both in terms of serving a whole range of different groups, having mixed communities, and also for underpinning the financial models of some providers. What I'd say is, if you have ideas, pilots, evidence about existing 10 years or new ones, don't wait to be invited to contribute them. Prepare them, work them up, publish, send them to government. I would, but of course, as Nick's pointed out, we do have that indication of a clear commitment to social rent. I think you can see that in lots of public statements that ministers have made, but it was also there in the spending review itself yesterday. We have an AHP especially for social rent, so I can provide some reassurance on that point. The rents question is really difficult in the chat. You've got lots of people emphasising the need for convergence. You've also got some people raising concerns about affordability. About a year ago, when I was doing some work for councils convened by Southwark, I went in thinking, why is it that we accept above inflation rent increases as a standard in social housing? And then I looked at the numbers and I understood that we absolutely need to go back to CPI plus 1%. And given the challenges that we have in rebuilding the stock, but also investing in the stock that we've already got, making up for decades of underinvestment and decline, and in particular, the 1% a year rent cut that we've had. If you look at it all in the round, I think you can make a really good case that it is fair to see some above inflation increase in rent, because of how much rents have decreased if you look at it in total. But also, people deserve to live in decent homes, and people that are living in temporary accommodation deserve to get out of that temporary accommodation. People that don't even have an entitlement to temporary accommodation in the first place have a right to expect better. We just cannot provide it if we don't get the revenue in some way. So again, my challenge back would be, if we don't want to be reliant on rent increases within the existing model, what are the alternatives? How might we go back and revisit the foundations of the rent formula? And what other ideas are there for getting revenue into the system? So yeah, please don't wait. Don't wait to be invited. Think about it. Publish. Feed ideas in.
Thanks, Rose, and yeah, do get in touch with us as well. So thanks very much. And Sophia, just I'll bring you in a few seconds about reflections on that as well, and whether that kind of joining the dots in terms of feeding that in, how that could be done better in order to avoid some of the problems we've just been talking about. I'll bring you into a few seconds, but Melanie first. There's a few questions coming through, quite specific ones. I'll start with the most general one, because I think you highlighted it earlier, and I think it is very significant potentially, but it would be perhaps good to add some detail to it, because I think this might be the bit that not all of our audience will have got to yet, which is the can you explain more about the review of the Green Book is the question. So I think in terms of why this is significant and what it might mean moving forwards, and also whether it's from what you've read, pitched in the right place. Yeah, Joe. So the question's a fairly broad one, but I think just talking about what the significance of that might be would be good to do.
Sure, thank you, Martin. I mean, I guess to answer the last bit first. I don't know how significant it will turn out to be, because it depends what government does through the review process, and we don't really know how that will play out. But what we do know is what the objectives of the review are. So then winding back, so the Green Book is the government Bible on how you make investment appraisals, and I mean, the historic criticism has been that it always disproportionately supports investment appraisals in higher value areas, because it's driven off numbers, and the values land values are higher, capital values are higher, rents are higher, etc., etc., etc. So if you just look at the numbers, then in general, if you're trying to decide as a government where to put money, you're going to look at the numbers and say we should go to the places where we'll get a better return, which is going to be London and the southeast. However, I think there's been a sort of a push for some time, which government, has been sort of listening to, but against all the kind of broader economic background and fiscal background that we've talked about, you can understand why they've been potentially slow to move. And this is not, I'm talking about the current government, I'm talking about successive governments. But the ambition is to reform the Green Book and how it's used, so that you can take a better approach to looking at the overall value that the government will get from public investment, particularly outside those high value areas in London and the southeast. So what are the reforms meant to do? They're meant to introduce place-based business cases. So basically that kind of takes a place-based approach rather than an academic approach, if you like, to the investment and the projects, to what's needed in a particular place in order to deliver national and local government objectives. So then you can also hopefully out of that get a proper assessment of the complementarities between the different elements, things like housing, but also infrastructure, transport, etc., and what in total is needed in order to achieve regeneration, etc., in a particular place. Simplifying the book, I mean, it's incredibly long and complicated, and I pity anyone who has to try and use it as a tool in practice to make an appraisal. So the objective is to simplify it so everyone can understand, and it's more transparent how government is making decisions, which, linking to earlier points I made, it also helps the private sector to understand, as it wants to provide complementary private sector investment alongside government investment, how the government's going to view those conversations and those decisions. Addressing the overemphasis on benefit cost ratios, which currently can be used pretty arbitrarily to decide whether it's stop or go on a particular project. So again, I think that's really about trying to take a more sophisticated approach to decision making. And finally, to help, and it's a point I think other panelists made earlier on, making it easier and trying to help the Green Book be a better tool for allowing civil servants and people who aren't close to the delivery end of all of this to understand how the decisions they make at that very sort of remote level will impact on the ground, and how they can factor that into the decision-making tools they have to use. And we'd all want them to have decision-making tools, because then that allows a greater degree of accountability and transparency around how governments make its decisions. But equally trying to import some of that knowledge that's in local authorities, that's in social housing deliverers, in transport deliverers on the ground, trying to import some of that knowledge into the tool so that they can make more informed and better decisions.
Thanks, Melanie. And I'm going to switch to one of those specific issues that we've been talking about as well. So from incredibly brilliant description about what the potential impact and the questions that remain with the Green Book. Lots of questions actually coming through about Section 106. So Melanie, I might come back to it. So we're talking about certainty. There's How will this help unlock the large number of Section 106 opportunities that registered providers won't bid for? Will the changes encourage RPs who've moved away from the purchase of units from Section 106 to reconsider? Quite brief answers. I'm sorry for quite a big question, but actually this is a remaining question. It's been a big question and obviously a big talking point in the sector for quite some time now. Is there any hope that yesterday gives us in terms of solving that particular problem? So Melanie, I'll come to you, and then Nick, but relatively quick answers if that's all right, just so we can get a couple more in.
Of course it is. So I mean, I can be very brief because I think Nick probably needs to answer it from the perspective of, will it unlock the capacity of the sector? But, from a private sector and investor point of view, from the people who are paying £7 billion of developer contributions a year, getting that money into delivering homes has to be the priority. It's not in anybody's interest that money is sitting there, not able to be spent. And we absolutely understand the constraints that have meant that it's not possible to unlock that, because housing associations just can't take the capacity that's there, but we have to unlock it. So yeah, if it supports the health of the sector to be able to start get that money moving and out to where it should be, which is delivering homes, then that's going to be fantastic.
Thanks, Melanie, and Nick.
Yeah, really quickly, 106s are a significant part of most developing housing associations programme. In my own organisation, they account for about 40% of our programme of between 500 and 700 homes a year. In terms of the quality, which I know sometimes is a debate, both in my own area of York and North Yorkshire, there is to be launched next month, an affordable home standard, which is basically setting a minimum requirement for 106s so that developers are really clear on what it is we're looking for. And that just replicates and mirrors an approach that I know the G15 group in London undertook and published earlier this year. In terms of the funding of 106s, just the grant itself won't make any difference because 106s aren't acquired with the use of Homes England grant funding. But actually what it does do in terms of the changes and certainty on rent levels is that enables us to then increase the levels of borrowing that housing associations are undertaking, which in turn then gives us more capacity to then be able to commit to a larger programme of Section 106 acquisitions.
Thanks very much, Nick. You just guaranteed yourself a phone call after this as well. So, yeah, thanks for that. And so I'm going to move on just to get through kind of one more group of questions, really. And I guess, Sophie, this kind of ties in with some of the conversations we've been having about joining the dots, and it's joining the dots in different ways. So I'm going to kind of slightly uncomfortably fix a few things together, but I guess things that were perhaps missing from the spending review. A few people have mentioned the ageing population, increasing disability, and inclusive kind of build. But yeah, I guess is there going to be an exacerbated gap in specialist and supported housing for people with complex needs? Yeah, how does it kind of, are we joining the dots, or are there still gaps within the system? And given that you did identify some of them earlier, how hopeful are you that given the kind of timelines and the promised kind of strategies that are coming, that they will actually be addressed? So are you going into it feeling pretty confident that some of those gaps will be looked at and addressed, or is there still concern? Are you still feeling the need to push quite hard to make sure we've got some kind of quite joined up strategies moving forwards?
I think supported housing, which speaks to a lot of those populations that have been raised in the questions, whether it's the ageing population, disability, multiple disadvantage, of course, homelessness. I think it's the elephant in the room, really, in terms of what was absent from the spending review. We've been pushing quite hard for greater investment in the support element of supported accommodation. It is the area where homelessness and housing associations have most crossover. There's a lot of collaborative delivery of supported accommodation in the homelessness sector. And And we haven't seen that. And I think that is an area where we still need to be raising awareness and pushing. I think there is still perhaps a lack of understanding about where supported housing sits. It seems to sort of sit between this gap between housing and homelessness, or other, particularly from that perspective, and doesn't quite fit with either of the strategies. It's sort of everyone's business and no one's business. So I think there is still, for me, concern there that the investment hasn't been realised. We would have wanted to see additional investment to be able to deliver the support contract, not just from the same pot. For me, I think that is still a fight that we need to be making. And I think there's a question about kind of how we can work collaboratively, certainly from the homelessness sector to the housing association sector. That's where we have the most kind of shared goal, I think, and can really speak with one voice and talk about the need and how that can be one of the keys to preventing and ending homelessness. A lot of people that we work with, what they need is good quality supported accommodation. It's just not there. And kind of working together to make that case and to demonstrate the value and effectiveness. But I would say perhaps the biggest disappointment in terms of spending review from our perspective.
Thanks very much, Sophie. And we are just about out of time. Rose, I might just invite you back in, given the conversation we've just been having. Any last reflections on that? And I think it sounds like you've been reading through some of the questions. So anything that we've missed that you want to respond to, and then we'll come to a close.
Okay. I'll try to be very quick. On supported housing, I would say let's learn from the successive arguments around the cost-benefit analysis of social rent housing, in particular with temporary accommodation. There is a largely unnoted scandal in supported housing with dodgy REITs profiting from exempt accommodation rates for housing benefit in supported housing. This is absolutely rinsing the taxpayer, as well as providing really poor services for people that need them. So I would be building up the evidence base around that. I would be banging that drum. It is, the dog that hasn't barked yet. On Section 106, I'm really, really grateful that Nick mentioned quality issues. There's been a lot of focus around financial capacity, but that's not the only issue here. As the regulatory environment has moved on and continues to move on, the Section 106 model that we've got is no longer fit for purpose, in my view. So we've been having a debate for years now about whether we keep the Section 106 system that we've got, or we curtail it in some ways because it's too difficult. How could we reform it and make it better? And please really do on that one, really do prioritise it. The G15 work on very specifically what's not going well with Section 106 homes at the moment has been really, really useful. More on that from the perspective of different places would be incredibly valuable. On the Green Book review, we actually had a Green Book review in 2020, and we had an update to the Green Book to account for wellbeing impacts in July 2021. The changes that have started to trickle through, but we've got a long way to go. And that's partly because we can change the rules about how Treasury makes its investment decisions. But if we don't have evidence from projects, whether here or internationally, to feed into that beast of a Green Book, we can't actually use that guidance. And I know that's really challenging because until we have the money to do, for example, regeneration projects, it's really difficult to feed that evidence in. But as far as possible, seek to create that evidence. And if that means working with colleagues elsewhere in other nations of the UK or internationally, that evidence works too. So changing the rules is one thing, but making use of them is another. The other thing that we haven't mentioned at all is devolution. So a big theme of government agenda in general and the spending review as well is devolution. We've not got to full devolution of housing funding and powers outside London yet, but there is a trajectory. How can we use the powers that combined authorities do have to make a difference for communities? Is more devolution part of the solution outside of London? And if so, how can we use the powers on funding already in place to make the case for more of it? I think I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Rose, and thank you to all of our panel today. I should say, I think most of you are in action in a couple of weeks' time at Housing 2025, where hopefully we'll be able to pick up that conversation and add even more flesh to the bones. Thank you for a really, really interesting and detailed discussion today. Lots to pick up on, lots to take away, and thank you all. To everybody who's tuned in as well for your questions, and hopefully we've got through a decent cross section, not all of them by any stretch, but hopefully a decent cross section of your questions today. Very much appreciated. Thank you all, and see you all very soon. Thank you.